August 1945. The fires over Tokyo have gone out, but the smoke still hangs heavy, trapped between the skeletal frames of buildings that were once homes. The war is over. Japan has surrendered, yet the silence that follows feels heavier than the bombing itself. In the rubble, women move like ghosts, carrying tin pots, searching for food, searching for the living. Many have lost husbands, brothers, sons. Their kimonos are torn, patched with scraps of army cloth. The empire they were taught to die for is gone. The soldiers they once worshipped are dead or prisoners. And now, new soldiers are coming. Trucks rumble through the ruins. American soldiers, young, clean-shaven, fed, step down into streets that smell of smoke and decay. Japanese civilians freeze. Mothers pull their children close. Every instinct screams to hide. Then something happens no one expected. One of the Americans takes off his jacket and hands it to a shivering girl. The war that burned the world has ended, with an act of kindness. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the nation ceased to exist as it had been known for centuries. The emperor's voice, soft, distant, divine, echoed through broken radios, declaring an end to a war that had consumed Asia and the Pacific. For the first time in history, the Japanese people heard him speak. His words carried no triumph, only surrender. What remained of the country was beyond comprehension. 66 cities had been bombed, 3 million dead, millions more homeless, fields burned, factories flattened, railways twisted into metal skeletons. Tokyo, once one of the world's most modern capitals, was reduced to a wasteland of ashes. The few who survived lived in shanties built from corrugated tin and charred lumber. Food was gone. Rice, once the foundation of every meal, became rarer than gold. People scavenged for barley, millet, even grass and bark. In some cities, mothers traded family heirlooms for a handful of sweet potatoes. Children lined up at train stations with empty bowls, hoping for scraps from passing soldiers. The black market flourished. Those with connections survived. Those without starved. Japan's wartime propaganda had promised honor in sacrifice. Now, the same government that demanded that loyalty no longer existed. The imperial army had vanished. Soldiers came home in rags, silent, defeated, many too ashamed to return at all. But the collapse hit women hardest. During the war, millions of men were drafted. Women filled their places in munitions, plants, farms, and civil offices. When the defeat came, those factories closed overnight. Wages stopped. Food rations disappeared. Many widows found themselves with children to feed and no way to earn. Prostitution, once forbidden under strict social codes, became a desperate form of survival. The once proud society of discipline and hierarchy disintegrated. Traditional values, obedience, purity, sacrifice, collided with hunger and despair. For Japanese women, humiliation was not just national. It was personal, and then came the Americans. Ships appeared in Tokyo Bay carrying men who, weeks earlier, had been the enemy. The occupying force numbered nearly 400,000 soldiers at its height. They landed not as conquerors in the European sense, but as administrators of an entirely new order. At their head was General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers. SCAP, his mission, to disarm Japan, prevent rebellion, and rebuild it into a peaceful, democratic nation. MacArthur knew the stakes. If the occupation failed, Japan could descend into chaos or fall under Soviet influence. To him, victory was no longer about weapons, but about hearts and minds. His policies reflected that. The Americans would feed, not punish. They would help, not humiliate. And, perhaps most importantly, they would show mercy. But to the Japanese, the first sight of American troops was terrifying. For years, wartime propaganda had painted them as beasts, brutal, merciless, devourers of women and children. Mothers whispered warnings. If you see an American, hide. Now, those same monsters walked through their villages offering chocolate, cigarettes, and canned food. The disbelief was overwhelming. The initial contact between conqueror and conquered was awkward, cautious, charged with unspoken fear. Japanese civilians bowed deeply. Americans tried to smile. Orders from SCAP were clear. No looting, no abuse, no revenge. Every GI was told they were not there to destroy Japan. They were there to civilize it. In the weeks that followed, American supply convoys began distributing food and medicine. They repaired bridges, reopened hospitals, and set up welfare offices. Yet, for the ordinary Japanese woman, none of that erased the shame of defeat. Her husband's uniform had become a symbol of loss. Her home, a pile of ashes. Her future, uncertain. Still, amid that despair, small gestures began to shift the air. A can of Spam given to a mother, a bar of soap traded for a smile, and, in some cases, the gift of clothing, a jacket, a blanket, a pair of boots, from a soldier who had more than he needed. They were acts without ceremony. But to those who received them, they felt impossible, almost unreal. The American uniform, once the image of terror, had become a source of warmth, and that single reversal of fear into gratitude marked the beginning of one of the most unexpected transformations in modern history. By autumn of 1945, the occupation was in full motion. Tokyo was filled with khaki trucks, signs in English, and the strange, comforting smell of American coffee drifting from makeshift field kitchens. The empire had fallen, yet order, somehow, was returning. The stars and stripes now fluttered above the same buildings where the rising sun had once hung in absolute power. But rebuilding Japan was not simply about infrastructure. It was about reprogramming a nation. The Americans faced a society indoctrinated by decades of imperial militarism. A people taught that surrender was worse than death. To break that mindset, General MacArthur pursued what he called the moral disarmament of Japan. The Military Occupation Force, known as SCAP, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, became the government in all but name. It issued laws, censored the press, purged militarists, and began rewriting the Constitution. Yet, while its legal reforms made headlines, the quiet humanitarian operations running in the background would transform lives more deeply than politics ever could. The first challenge was survival. Japan's harvest of 1945 was the worst in modern history. Crops had failed, supply lines had collapsed, and the black market was devouring what little remained. Millions were starving. Malnutrition spread across cities, especially among children. Winter loomed. MacArthur knew that if starvation swept Japan, the occupation would fail before it began. So, under emergency directives, the U.S. launched massive aid programs, first through army rations and later through international relief shipments. These would evolve into WWII, the Government Aid and Relief in Occupied Areas Program, one of the earliest large-scale American humanitarian projects of the modern era. Between 1945 and 1949, WWII provided more than $2 billion worth of food, medicine, and clothing to Japan, an astronomical sum for the time. Ships arrived daily carrying wheat, powdered milk, and surplus army uniforms. American soldiers became the distributors of survival itself. But this aid was not just about logistics. It was psychological reconstruction. The U.S. government realized that generosity could achieve what bombs could not: the surrender of the Japanese heart. To the occupying soldiers, orders were clear: show restraint, kindness, and discipline. There would be no revenge, no looting, no humiliation of civilians. Instead, soldiers were to act as ambassadors of democracy, examples of how freedom behaved. And so began a strange, quiet transformation. In the ruins of bombed-out schools, GIs taught children English. At hospitals, American nurses helped Japanese doctors treat the wounded. At relief stations, boxes marked USA appeared, filled with canned goods, bandages, and clothing sent from American families thousands of miles away. The response from the Japanese was complex. At first, many refused the gifts. Shame ran deep in their culture. To receive charity from the enemy was a wound to pride. But hunger, cold, and the sight of their children changed that pride into gratitude. Women, especially, became the first to interact closely with occupation troops. Their husbands were dead or missing. Their homes were gone. Yet many recalled how the Americans treated them, not as spoils of war, but as people. There were stories, repeated quietly, almost disbelievingly, of American soldiers giving away their own overcoats, offering blankets, even cutting their uniforms in half to make smaller garments for children. One Tokyo mother later wrote, "They gave us food, and we wept. Then they gave us clothes. We did not understand how an enemy could do this. But when I saw my daughter smiling again, I began to believe the war was truly over." The symbolism was powerful. For 4 years, Japanese propaganda had dehumanized the American soldier, calling him a barbarian, a beast. Now, those same barbarians were mending roofs, feeding children, and draping shivering civilians in their own coats. What began as an occupation slowly evolved into a human connection. Every shared meal, every traded garment, every shy smile began to dissolve the bitterness of war. American generosity was not perfect. There were incidents of misconduct, black market corruption, and resentment. Yet compared to the vengeance many nations inflicted upon the defeated, Japan's occupation was astonishingly humane. This humanity reshaped Japan's image of America and America's image of itself. For the first time, the world. The plan worked better than anyone could have imagined. Within 2 years, surveys showed that most Japanese civilians now viewed Americans favorably. It was a psychological victory without bloodshed, achieved through compassion rather than conquest. The image of the foreign soldier had changed. No longer a threat, but a helper. No longer a destroyer, but a rescuer. But the change ran deeper than politics. In a culture built on pride and endurance, accepting charity from outsiders was once unthinkable. Japan had been raised on gammon, the strength to endure silently, to never show weakness. To wear American clothing in public was, at first, a mark of shame. Many women unstitched the patches from their donated coats before leaving home. The olive-drab fabric, once worn by the enemy, carried a weight no one knew how to bear. Over time, however, perception began to shift. Survival has its own logic. Warmth mattered more than pride. The jackets stayed on, and soon they became something else entirely. Symbols of resilience, even rebirth. American garments were practical, durable, modern. They represented a kind of freedom that Japan had never known. Tailors began to remake army coats into children's wear. Parachute silk became dresses. Soldiers' blankets were turned into winter coats. The new Japan, fragile, hungry, yet alive, was wrapping itself in the fabric of its former enemy. What began as humiliation became hope. The uniform that once symbolized fear now carried safety. The hands that once brought war now offered peace. And in that reversal, the Japanese people, especially the women who had suffered most, discovered that kindness could heal what armies could not. It was a quiet revolution, one not written in treaties or broadcast by governments, but lived in alleys and back streets in gestures too small for history books. Yet it was here, in these unseen moments, that Japan's rebirth truly began. As the months passed, the occupation began to take on a rhythm. The sound of military trucks no longer drew fear, but curiosity. Children waved at passing convoys, hoping for a piece of candy tossed from a soldier's hand. The Americans, once strangers, were slowly becoming part of the city's daily heartbeat. But behind the scenes, something larger was unfolding, a moral campaign unlike anything the modern world had seen. Across the Pacific, church groups, charities, and schools in the United States were mobilizing to help the defeated nation. Women's organizations, many led by mothers who had lost sons in the war, began collecting clothes, blankets, and baby garments to send overseas. They stitched, packed, and labeled each box with care, writing simple notes like, "From one mother to another." In 1946 alone, more than 1 million pounds of clothing reached Japan through these drives. Ships docked in Yokohama, carrying containers stacked with parcels that had crossed oceans. Garments once worn in Chicago, Kansas, or New York, now destined for families in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Inside each box was more than fabric. There was a message. Mercy was stronger than revenge. When those parcels were opened, many Japanese women wept. They touched the foreign textures: wool, cotton, denim, materials scarce since before the war. Some of the clothes still carried faint scents of soap or perfume. Others had notes tucked inside, written by American women whose children had fought on Pacific islands not far from Japan's shores. The symbolism was staggering. The enemy's mothers were now clothing the children of the defeated. Christian missionaries, too, returned to Japan under MacArthur's approval. Churches reopened. Bible study groups offered English lessons and community gatherings. While religion was not the driving force behind the occupation, its message, forgiveness, charity, renewal, found quiet resonance among those who had lost everything. Some of the earliest organized clothing drives were run by church missions that saw in Japan not a fallen nation, but a soul ready to rebuild. For Japanese women, these gestures carried a moral weight far beyond material aid. The war had left them stripped of everything, not just possessions, but identity. The empire that once dictated their role as obedient wives and mothers had collapsed. Now, confronted with American ideals of equality and independence, many began to see the world differently. The act of receiving, of being cared for rather than commanded, became its own kind of liberation. Sociologists later described this period as Japan's moral reconstruction. The gifts of clothing, food, and compassion did not just fill empty bellies. They rewired the nation's emotional compass. Humility replaced pride. Cooperation replaced defiance. It was as if the simple human act of giving and receiving had rewritten the country's sense of self. The transformation reached even the realm of symbolism. In a society that once valued formality and restraint, gratitude now found physical expression. Civilians began bowing not just to officials, but to American soldiers handing out supplies. Children would salute, laugh, and say, "Thank you," in halting English. These gestures of politeness, deeply rooted in Japanese custom, now merged with Western informality, creating a new hybrid language of peace. And yet, it wasn't only Japan that changed. Many American soldiers were transformed as well. They had expected hostility, perhaps even revenge. Instead, they found humility, politeness, and heartbreaking gratitude. Letters sent home tell of GIs who admitted they had never felt more respected in their lives. "These people bow when we walk by," one wrote. "They call us sir, even when we give them rations. It makes you want to be worthy of it." In those moments, the conquerors became caretakers, and the defeated taught the victors a lesson about dignity. The relationship between the two nations, once defined by annihilation, began to evolve into one of mutual respect. Of course, the occupation was not without its flaws. There were black markets, crimes, and moments of bitterness. But those incidents, while real, were overwhelmed by the larger story. A quiet moral revolution led not by generals, but by mothers, nurses, and ordinary soldiers. The act of giving clothes may have seemed trivial against the scale of Hiroshima or Tokyo's ruins, but it was precisely in its simplicity that its power lay. A coat could not erase war crimes or atomic shadows, but it could make one person warm, one night bearable. And from those small mercies grew something enduring, a belief that humanity could be rebuilt, one gesture at a time. By 1948, the psychological divide between conqueror and conquered had blurred almost completely. Japanese civilians referred to American soldiers not as occupiers, but as helpers. English words like kindness and peace entered school books, and when the last shipments of donated clothing arrived, they were no longer seen as foreign. They were Japan's own story of rebirth. The memory of those days would outlast the occupation itself. Generations later, survivors still spoke of it not as a period of shame, but as the moment when they rediscovered compassion, first from strangers, then within themselves. The war had begun in fire. It ended in fabric, soft, ordinary, human. And in that gentle transformation, Japan learned what victory truly meant. Winter came early that year. The ashes of Tokyo were still warm from summer's fires when the first snow fell. In the skeletal remains of houses, families burned anything they could find. Broken furniture, paper walls, sometimes even scraps of books, to keep the cold away. The empire that had dreamed of ruling Asia could no longer feed its own children. By December 1945, Japan faced a catastrophe that could have eclipsed the war itself. Fields lay barren, coal was scarce, food imports had collapsed, starvation loomed like a second enemy, silent and unstoppable. People fainted in bread lines. Black markets thrived on desperation. Mothers rationed a single sweet potato among 5 mouths. The word hunger was no longer a complaint. It was life itself. And then, into this frozen despair, the Americans began to act. Across the ruins, army trucks appeared, their green paint now symbols of hope. Soldiers moved through the streets not with rifles at the ready, but with sacks of flour, boxes of rations, and bundles of surplus uniforms. What began as military supply distribution turned into something almost sacred. For many civilians, the arrival of those convoys was the difference between life and death. Reports from the time describe scenes both heartbreaking and surreal. In Tokyo's Ueno district, crowds gathered in silence as American soldiers unloaded blankets and coats from trucks. A woman carrying an infant approached shyly, her head bowed almost to the ground. When a soldier handed her a wool jacket, she burst into tears, clutching it as if it were made of gold. The baby inside began to cry too, not from fear, but from hunger. The soldier reached into his pack, took out a can of condensed milk, and gave it to her. She fell to her knees, sobbing into the snow. Moments like this repeated across the country. In Yokosuka, sailors donated their own clothing to dock workers. In Osaka, an American unit turned its barracks into a soup kitchen, feeding hundreds of civilians daily. In small mountain towns, soldiers hiked through snowdrifts to deliver food to schools. They were not saints, they were tired young men far from home. But their humanity endured. Many wrote letters to their families describing what they saw. "I never thought I'd feel sorry for the Japanese," one GI confessed. "But you can't look at a starving kid and think about Pearl Harbor." For Japanese civilians, these gestures carried a weight beyond comprehension. They had been told the Americans would enslave them, humiliate them, erase their culture. Instead, they arrived with food and warmth. The American officials noticed the change too. Reports sent to Washington in 1946 and 1947 described a profound softening of Japanese attitudes. MacArthur's staff understood what that meant. Kindness had succeeded where ideology had failed. Japan was no longer resisting occupation. It was cooperating with it. The people who had once sworn to die before surrender were now helping rebuild their own democracy. Voluntarily, even proudly. Schools reopened with American-supplied materials. Teachers distributed donated textbooks printed in English. Hospitals received shipments of medical supplies marked with red crosses and stars. The same symbol that had once appeared on bombers now arrived on boxes of antibiotics. It was a transformation no strategist could have predicted. A victory that required no gunfire. And it wasn't only the Japanese who changed. American soldiers, too, carried those memories for life. Many returned home unable to reconcile what they had been told about Japan with what they had witnessed. They had expected bitterness. Instead, they found humility and warmth. Some wrote that they learned more about forgiveness in those few months than in all their years of war. One sergeant from Illinois recalled how, after giving away his coat to a Japanese child, he later saw the boy wearing it every day on his way to school. It was too big for him, he said, but he wore it like it meant something. I realized maybe it did. It did. For that boy, and for millions like him, the American coat became the first tangible proof that the nightmare was over. It was not just protection from the cold. It was protection from the past. As Japan slowly began to rise from its ruins, these quiet exchanges between soldiers and civilians became the foundation for something enduring. A new relationship was forming, not of conqueror and conquered, but of partners rebuilding a shattered world together. By the late 1940s, public opinion surveys in Japan revealed a remarkable shift. The majority of citizens now viewed the United States favorably. In only a few years, a nation that once vowed to annihilate America had come to see it as a model, even a friend. The power of that change lay not in treaties or speeches, but in the silent language of compassion. In the end, the transformation of Japan did not begin in a courtroom or a conference hall. It began in a cold street, with a soldier's outstretched hand and a coat given freely to someone who had nothing. That moment, unrecorded by cameras, unnoticed by history books, was the true turning point. Because on that day, Japan stopped being the defeated and began becoming human again. By 1947, the ashes of war had begun to settle into the soil of a new Japan. The ruins were still there, endless and gray, but something had changed in the air. The sound of hammers had returned. Markets reopened. Trains began to run again through cities that had once been nothing but twisted steel. From the same ground where the war had ended in despair, life was taking root. American aid had stabilized the country. The emergency food shipments continued. But now there was more. School supplies, medical kits, construction tools. Garioa funds rebuilt roads, repaired hospitals, and reopened factories. In classrooms, children read from books printed with English and Japanese side by side. In hospitals, Japanese nurses worked alongside American doctors. The occupation was no longer just about disarmament. It had become a full-scale rebirth. For women, the transformation was profound. Before the war, Japanese society had confined them to silence. Obedient daughters, faithful wives, unseen workers. But the collapse of the empire tore those old structures apart. Under the guidance of the occupation government, women were granted the right to vote, own property, and pursue education. The gift of clothing and food had been the beginning. The gift of freedom followed. It was not easy. Poverty still bit deep. Many widows still lived in makeshift homes of scrap metal and wood. Yet slowly, confidence returned. Some women found jobs in the relief offices themselves, helping distribute the same American goods they had once received. Others became teachers or nurses. The very generation that had been taught to die for the emperor was now being taught to live for themselves. In the countryside, farmers began cultivating rice again, with tools imported from America. The seeds of wheat that once arrived in relief ships now grew in Japanese soil. Urban workers found employment rebuilding factories under contracts paid by U.S. funds. It was as if the machinery of survival had turned into the machinery of recovery. American soldiers who had stayed behind, as part of the occupation, watched it all unfold. They had arrived as victors, but many left as witnesses to something larger than victory. the transformation of an enemy into an ally. They saw how the smallest gestures from the early days of occupation had rippled outward. A jacket given to a child had become a thread connecting two nations. A can of food had become the first step toward trust. In 1947, the new Japanese constitution came into effect. It renounced war, guaranteed civil rights, and placed sovereignty in the hands of the people. Behind the formal language of democracy lay something more human, the moral awakening that had begun with mercy. MacArthur's influence loomed over everything, but even he admitted that Japan's recovery was not the product of command. It was the product of cooperation. These people, he wrote, have shown a capacity for renewal that has no parallel. By now, the American presence in Japan had taken on a different tone. It was no longer the presence of conquerors, but of partners. Soldiers volunteered in schools, helped plant crops, even played baseball with local children. American uniforms were still visible, but they no longer inspired fear. To most Japanese, they had become part of the landscape of safety. The moral effect of those years was impossible to measure, but easy to feel. When Japanese citizens looked at the Americans, they no longer saw the face of war. They saw the embodiment of something they had nearly forgotten: decency. And when Americans looked back, they saw not the enemy of Pearl Harbor, but a people capable of grace under ruin. The old wounds did not disappear overnight. Hiroshima and Nagasaki remained sacred scars. There was grief that would never fade, and shame that could not be erased. But amid that pain grew something unexpected: respect. The Japanese had learned that defeat did not have to mean humiliation, and the Americans had discovered that mercy could win a peace no weapon could enforce. It was in these years that the two nations began to move toward one another, not as opposites, but as equals. Trade reopened. Cultural exchanges followed. American goods filled Japanese markets, and Japanese craftsmanship began to influence American industries in return. From tragedy emerged partnership, quiet at first, then unbreakable. And through it all, those early images remained etched in memory. Soldiers sharing food in a bombed-out street, children wrapped in coats far too big for them, mothers bowing in gratitude with tears in their eyes. They were the living proof that humanity could survive even history's darkest winters. The Japan that rose from the ruins was not the same nation that had gone to war. It was gentler, wiser, and strangely stronger, because it had learned, through the kindness of strangers, how to begin again. By the end of the 1940s, Japan was no longer a defeated empire. It was a nation in transition, fragile but breathing, humble but determined. The ruins were still visible, yet so was renewal. Cities once blackened by fire now flickered with new light. Streetcars rolled again. Schools reopened. Markets buzzed with trade. The rhythm of life had returned, and in that rhythm, the heartbeat of a new identity could be heard. The United States continued to send aid, but something had shifted. Japan was no longer a ward of occupation. It was becoming a partner in reconstruction. American advisors worked beside Japanese engineers on industrial recovery. Relief stations evolved into training centers. The spirit of dependency gave way to cooperation. A sense of gratitude ran deep in the public memory. Many Japanese still spoke of the soldiers who had handed them clothes or food in the darkest winter. Those acts had become stories told within families of kindness when kindness seemed impossible. Mothers reminded their children that the coat they wore had once belonged to an American. Teachers used those moments as lessons on humility, forgiveness, and rebirth. Even decades later, survivors described how that simple generosity had planted something enduring in their hearts: the belief that compassion could exist even in the ashes of war. By 1951, Japan had officially regained its sovereignty under the Treaty of San Francisco. The occupation ended, but the connection it created did not. Instead, it deepened. In the same year, Japan signed the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, a pact that turned former enemies into military allies. The same American presence that had once been viewed as domination now became a guarantee of safety in a rapidly changing world. What had begun with a single gesture, a coat, offered to a stranger, evolved into a partnership that would shape the Pacific for generations. American aid gave Japan stability, but Japanese discipline and determination transformed that aid into progress. Within 2 decades, Japan would rise from post-war poverty to become one of the world's leading economies. Factories that once produced weapons now built radios, cameras, and cars. The American soldier's coat had become a symbol of warmth. The American blueprint had become a foundation for prosperity. The moral shift was just as profound. The Japanese people, once bound by strict hierarchies and wartime obedience,